Hey guys, today we're going to be speaking about ISA 600, or more specifically, using the work of other auditors. The purpose of this ISA 600 is to establish standards and provide guidance when an auditor uses the work of another auditor on the financial information of one or more components included in the financial statements of the entity. Further, when the principal auditor concludes that the financial statements of a component are immaterial, the standards in this ISA do not apply. When, however, several components, immaterial in themselves, are together material, the procedures outlined in this ISA would need to be considered. When the principal auditor uses the work of another auditor, the principal auditor should determine how the work of the other auditor will affect the audit. A principal auditor means the auditor with responsibility for reporting on the financial statements of an entity when those financial statements include financial information of one or more components audited by another auditor. Other auditor means an auditor other than a principal auditor with the responsibility for reporting on the financial information of a component which is included in the financial statements audited by the principal auditor. Other auditors include affiliated firms, whether using the same name or not, and correspondents, as well as unrelated auditors. Component means a division, branch, subsidiary, joint venture, associated company, or other entity whose financial information is included in the financial statements audited by the principal auditor. Using the work of other auditors, there is uncertainty about the actual meaning of these words in context of ISAs as well as the actual requirements of these other auditors. The meaning of another auditor or other auditor further serves to clarify that uncertainties about whether the auditor is using the work of another auditor's expert or another auditor. Such uncertainty could only result in a non-application or the application of requirements of the incorrect ISAs, which could result in deficiencies in the audit documentation or a lack of sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support the auditor's opinion in the financial statements. There are specific references in ISAs. The auditor has to comply with all ISAs relevant to the audit, including all relevant requirements read together with the related application material. The following specific references are relevant in considering the specific question presented here. ISA 402, which refers to audit considerations relating to an entity using a service organization. Paragraph A19 of ISA 402 states that another auditor may be used to perform procedures that will provide the necessary information about the relevant control at the service organization. If a Type 1 or Type 2 report has been issued, the user auditor may use the service auditor to perform these procedures as the service auditor has an existing relationship with the service organization. The user auditor using the work of another auditor may find the guidance in ISA 6009 useful as it relates to understanding another auditor. Involvement in the work of another auditor in planning the nature, extent, and timing of such work, and in evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of the audit evidence obtained. ISA 600 refers to using the work of other auditors, states that an auditor may find this ISA adapted as necessary in the circumstances useful when the auditor involves other auditors in the audit of financial statements that are not group financial statements. For example, an auditor may involve another auditor to observe the inventory count or inspect a fixed asset at a remote location. Further so, paragraph 827 states that another auditor may perform procedures that are substantive in nature for the benefit of the user auditors. Such an engagement may involve the performance by another auditor of procedures agreed upon by the user entity and its user auditor, and by the service organization and its service auditor. The findings resulting from these procedures performed by another auditor are reviewed by the user auditor to determine whether they constitute sufficient appropriate audit evidence. In addition, there may be requirements imposed by governmental authorities or through contractual arrangements whereby a service auditor performs designated procedures that are substantive in nature. The results of the application of the required procedures to balances and transactions processed by the service organization may be used by the user auditors as part of the evidence necessary to support the audit opinions. In these circumstances, it may be useful for the user auditor and the service auditor to agree prior to the performance of the procedures to the audit documentation or access to audit documentation that will be provided to the user auditor. There is no specific ISA that applies to the scenario where the auditor uses the work of another auditor or other auditors. Instead, the following terms are defined and referred to in the ISAs, and if the auditor uses these practitioners to perform the work on his or her behalf or uses the work they have already performed, the requirements and guidance of the ISA concerned have to be applied. Service auditor relates to an auditor who, at the request of the service organization, provides an assurance report on the controls of a service organization. Component auditor, an auditor who, at the request of the group engagement team, performs work on the financial information related to a component for the group audit. Internal auditors, these individuals who perform the activities of the internal audit functions. Internal auditors may belong to an internal audit department or equivalent function. ISA 402 and ISA 600 state that ISA 600 could be useful when the auditor uses other auditors, and under these circumstances, the requirements of the standard would have to be appropriately adapted. Although ISA 600 includes requirements that address using of the work component auditors in audits of the group financial statements, the principles contained in the following paragraphs, adapted as necessary in the circumstance, may be relevant in providing the auditor with guidance on additional procedures that can be performed in ensuring that sufficient appropriate audit evidence is obtained when using the work of another auditor or other auditors in the instances. ISA 600 paragraph 19 to 20, which relates to understanding the component auditor. If a group engagement team plans to request a component auditor to perform work on the financial information of a component, the group engagement team shall obtain an understanding of the following. Whether a component auditor understands and will comply with the ethical requirements that are relevant to the group audit, and in particular is independent. The component auditor's professional competence, whether the group engagement team will be able to be involved in the work of a component auditor to the extent necessary to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And lastly, whether the component auditor operates in a regulatory environment that actively oversees auditors. ISA 600 paragraph 24, which relates to responding to assessed risks, the auditor is required to design and implement appropriate responses to address the assessed risk of material misstatement of the financial statements. The group engagement team shall determine the type of work to be performed by the group engagement team or the component auditors on its behalf on the financial information of the components. The group engagement team shall also determine the nature, timing, and extent of its involvement in the work of the component auditors. ISA 600 paragraph 40 and 41 deals with communication with the component auditor. The group engagement team shall communicate its requirements to the component auditor on a timely basis. This communication shall set out the work to be performed, the use to be made of that work, and the form and content of the component auditor's communication with the group engagement team. It shall also include the following. A request that a component auditor, knowing the context in which the group engagement team will use the work of the component auditor, confirms that the component auditor will cooperate with the group engagement team. The ethical requirements that are relevant to the group. In the case of an audit or review of the financial information of component materiality, the component materiality and the threshold above which misstatements cannot be regarded as clearly trivial to the group financial statements. Identified significant risks of material misstatement of the group financial statements due to fraud or error, and that are relevant to the work of the component auditor. The group engagement team shall request the component auditor to communicate on a timely basis any other identified significant risk of material misstatement of the group financial statements due to fraud or error in the component and the component auditor's responses to such risks. Paragraph 44 and 45 deals with evaluating the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence obtained. The auditor is required to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to reduce the audit risk to an acceptably low level and thereby enable the auditor to draw reasonable conclusions on which to base the auditor's opinion. The group engagement team shall evaluate the other sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained from the audit procedures performed on the consolidation process and the work performed by the group engagement team. and the component auditors on the financial information of the components on which to base the group audit opinion. ISA 600 paragraph 50 deals with documentation. The group engagement team shall include in the documentation the following matters: an analysis of the components indicating those that are significant and the type of work performed on the financial information of the components, the nature, timing, and extent of the group engagement team involvement in the work performed by the component auditors on significant components, including, where applicable, the group engagement team's review of relevant parts of the component auditors' audit documentation and conclusions thereon. And lastly, written communications between the group engagement team and the component auditors about the group engagement team's requirements. In conclusion, we see that the requirements of ISA 600 may be adapted as necessary when the work of another auditor or other auditors is used. Although there is no specific ISA that applies to the scenario where the auditor uses the work of another auditor or other auditors, it is prudent for the auditor to perform additional procedures that he or she considers necessary and appropriate in the interest of ensuring that sufficient audit evidence has been obtained. The nature, timing, and extent of such procedures will involve the application of the auditor's professional judgment, taking into account the specific client and engagement circumstances. The documentation requirements in ISA 230 are applicable, and auditors should ensure that their considerations regarding the work of another auditor or other auditors are sufficiently and appropriately documented in the audit file.